March 7th, 1945. A grey morning in Hamburg, Germany. The knock came at 6 a.m. American soldiers filled the doorway, rifles ready. Liesl Hartmann, 18 years old, looked to her mother for protection and watched that mother raise a finger, point directly at her own daughter, and say in broken English, she was Wehrmacht radio operator. No hesitation, no tears, just betrayal wrapped in 4 words. They had told Liesl the Americans would torture her, starve her, break her bones for information she did not have. Instead, 6 weeks later, in a prisoner camp in frozen Minnesota, an enemy soldier handed her a cup of hot chocolate and began teaching her what a real father looked like. This was not propaganda. This was not a trick. This was one woman's impossible truth that sometimes the enemy shows you more love than your own blood ever did. This story will break your heart. Then it will put it back together. And by the end, you will understand something important. Family is not about blood. Family is about who shows up when you need them most. If these kinds of stories move you, then hit that subscribe button, tap the like button, and watch until the end, because the moment Liesl finally confronts her mother is something you will never forget. Now let's go back to the beginning. Liesl Hartmann never imagined her own mother would be the one to destroy her. She was 18 years old in the winter of 1945, thin, pale, dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. She had been working as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, the German military in Hamburg. Not a soldier, not a fighter, just a young woman who sat at a desk, wore headphones and passed messages from one office to another. She had never fired a gun, she had never seen combat, but she wore the uniform, and in those final days of the war, that was enough to make her an enemy. Hamburg fell to the British in early March. The city was already broken. Over 42,000 civilians had died in the bombing raids of 1943 alone. Buildings stood like skeletons against the grey sky. The streets smelled of smoke and wet stone, and something worse beneath it all. Death had become ordinary. When the occupation began, Liesl knew she was in danger. Wehrmacht personnel were being rounded up, interrogated, sent to camps. She needed to hide. She needed somewhere safe. She thought of her mother. The small apartment where Liesl had grown up was still standing. A miracle, really, when so much around it had been turned to rubble. Liesl made her way through the broken streets, avoiding patrols, keeping her head down. When she finally climbed the stairs and knocked on that familiar door, her heart was pounding, but she felt hope. Mothers protect their children. That is what mothers do. The door opened. Her mother stood there, thinner than Liesl remembered, older, more worn. For one brief moment, Liesl saw relief in her mother's eyes. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter had come home. Then the relief changed. It hardened into something cold, something calculating. "Come in," her mother said. "Rest. You look tired." Liesl slept on the floor that night, wrapped in a thin blanket, listening to the sounds of the occupied city outside. She dreamed of peace. She dreamed of waiting out the chaos until everything settled down. The next morning, at 6 a.m., the knock came. Liesl sat up, confused. Her mother was already at the door, already opening it. American soldiers stood in the hallway, rifles ready. An officer stepped forward, looking at a piece of paper in his hand. "Liesl Hartmann?" he asked. Before Liesl could speak, before she could run or hide or even think, her mother raised her hand. She pointed directly at her own daughter, and she said, in broken English, that she must have practiced. She was Wehrmacht, radio operator. Just like that. 4 words, no hesitation, no tears, no apology. Liesl stared at her mother. She waited for an explanation. She waited for her mother to say it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a trick to protect her somehow. But her mother did not look at her. Her mother looked at the American officer and waited. "Come with us," the officer said to Liesl. They took her that morning. They put her in a truck with other prisoners, soldiers, clerks, drivers, nurses, all of them wearing the same hollow expression, all of them afraid. Liesl did not cry when they arrested her. She did not cry during the interrogation at the processing center. She did not cry when they told her she would be transported to a prisoner of war camp. But inside, something had broken, something that would never fully heal. Later, she would learn why her mother had done it. The occupying forces were giving extra food rations to Germans who provided information. Bread, meat, butter, things that had become more valuable than gold in the starving city. Her mother had traded her daughter for a full stomach. I never forgot her face in that moment, Liesl would later write in her journal. The way she pointed at me like I was a stranger, like I was nothing. This was the paradox that would haunt her for years. Her own mother had betrayed her to the enemy, and the enemy, as she would soon discover, would treat her with more kindness than her own blood ever had. But that discovery was still weeks away. First, she had to survive the journey. The journey to the port took 3 days by train. Liesl sat pressed against the wooden wall of a boxcar, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to make herself small. 60 women packed into a space meant for 40. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and fear. The train swayed and rattled over damaged tracks, stopping and starting without warning. They were given water twice a day, ladled through a small window in the door. Thin soup came with it, watery broth with a few pieces of potato floating in it. Liesl drank, but she could not eat. Her throat closed up every time she tried to swallow. At night, the women talked in low voices, sharing rumors, feeding each other's terror. The Americans will work us to death in labor camps, one woman whispered. They will starve us, another said. Revenge for what Germany did. I heard they torture prisoners for information, someone else added. Even if you have nothing to tell them. Liesl listened, but did not speak. She had nothing left to say. Her mother's betrayal had emptied her of words. When the train finally reached the port, Liesl saw the ship that would take them across the Atlantic. It was enormous, a converted troop transport painted military grey. American sailors moved across the deck with smooth efficiency, calling to each other in English that Liesl could barely understand. The prisoners were marched aboard in lines. Each woman was given a number and a tag. Liesl became prisoner 3847, that was all she was now. A number, a problem to be transported and stored. The Atlantic crossing took 14 days. Liesl spent most of it in the hold with the other women, lying in a narrow metal bunk, stacked 3 high. The ship's engines ran constantly, a deep vibration she could feel in her bones. The air below deck was thick and hot, heavy with the smell of diesel fuel and too many bodies pressed together. Some women got violently seasick from the rolling motion of the waves. Others cried at night, muffling their sobs in thin blankets. Liesl did neither. She simply lay there, staring at the bunk above her, thinking about her mother's finger, that pointing, those 4 words. She was Wehrmacht. But something strange began to happen during those 14 days. The American sailors did not treat them like animals. They did not beat them. They did not withhold food or water. In fact, the rations on the ship were better than anything Liesl had eaten in the final year of the war. Real bread, canned meat, hot coffee. This must be a trick, one woman said. They fatten us up before they kill us. But the sailors just looked tired, bored even, like transporting enemy prisoners was simply another job. One sailor, barely 20 years old, even smiled at Liesl once when he handed her a cup of water. A genuine smile, not cruel, not mocking, just human. It confused her. The enemy was supposed to be monsters. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor, Liesl caught her first glimpse of America through a porthole. The skyline took her breath away. Buildings taller than anything she had ever seen, untouched by bombs gleaming in the winter sunlight. In Hamburg, entire neighborhoods were flattened. Here, everything stood intact, clean, impossibly wealthy. Over 2,800 prisoners of war arrived in New York that week alone. Liesl was just one small piece of a massive operation. The United States held over 425,000 German POWs on American soil by the end of the war, more than any other Allied nation. They were marched off the ship and onto trains heading west. No one explained where they were going. No one told them what would happen next. The prisoners simply followed orders, too exhausted and too frightened to ask questions. For 3 more days, Liesl traveled by train through the American countryside. She pressed her face to the cold window glass, watching towns roll past. Small houses with yards, cars on clean roads, children playing outside schools, shops with signs and merchandise in the windows. Everything looked whole, untouched, normal. "How can they live like this?" one woman whispered. "Don't they know there is a war?" But the war had never reached American soil, not like it had reached Germany. And that contrast between the ruins of Hamburg and the tidy streets of Minnesota would become the first crack in everything Liesl had been taught to believe. The train finally stopped at a small station. The sign read, St. Paul, Minnesota. It was late afternoon. Snow covered everything, more snow than Liesl had ever seen in her life. What came next would shatter everything else. Buses waited at the station. 20 women per bus, driven north through the snow. Liesl sat by a frozen window, watching the Minnesota landscape pass. Forests, frozen lakes, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys. Everything white and silent and strange. After an hour, the bus turned through a gate marked Camp Co., U.S. Army. This was it. This was where her new life, or her death, would begin. The camp was smaller than Liesl had expected, not some massive prison complex, but a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fence. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the guards looked bored, leaning against railings, smoking cigarettes. The women were led into a building marked Processing. Inside, American soldiers sat behind desks, paperwork spread before them. They looked up as the women entered. Their expressions were not cruel or angry. They looked tired, maybe a little curious. That was all. One by one, the women were called forward, names checked, photographs taken, each woman given a file number. When Liesl's turn came, she stepped forward on shaking legs. The soldier behind the desk was older than the others, maybe in his late 40s, with grey at his temples and kind eyes. His name tag read, Sergeant H. Thompson. He looked at her paperwork, then looked up at her. Liesl Hartman, he read slowly, his accent thick, but his pronunciation careful. 18 years old, radio operator. He paused. You look cold. Liesl did not know what to say. She was cold. She had been cold for weeks, but she did not think it mattered. Sergeant Thompson stood up and walked to a cabinet. He pulled out a thick wool blanket and walked back. He held it out to her. Here, he said. Wrap this around yourself. Liesl stared at the blanket. This had to be a trick, a test. She did not move. Thompson's expression softened. It's okay, he said gently. You're safe here. Take it. Slowly, Liesl reached out and took the blanket. The wool was heavy and warm. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks the cold began to recede. Good, Thompson said. He made a note in her file. You'll be assigned to Barracks C. Dinner is at 6. Someone will show you where to go. He paused, looking at her again. You're going to be okay, Liesl. She had expected punishment. She had expected cruelty. She had not expected her name spoken with kindness. After processing, the women were directed to the shower building. Liesl's heart pounded. This was where it would happen, she thought. This was where the cruelty would start. But inside, the room was warm, heated by radiators along the walls. Clean towels hung on hooks. A female American officer stood waiting, her uniform neat, her face neutral, but not unkind. You will shower here, the officer said in clear German. Hot water, clean towels, new clothes will be provided. The women exchanged glances. Could this be real? They were handed bars of soap, real soap, white and smooth, smelling like flowers. Not the harsh lye soap Liesl had used in Hamburg. She held it in her hand, staring at it. When was the last time she had smelled flowers? The showers had individual stalls with curtains. Liesl stepped into one and turned the handle. Hot water poured over her head. She gasped, actually hot. It ran down her back, washing away weeks of grime and sweat and fear. She stood there, eyes closed, letting the water run. And for the first time since her mother's betrayal, Liesel began to cry. She cried silently, letting the water wash away her tears. She cried for the mother who had pointed at her. She cried for the home that no longer existed. And somewhere beneath all that pain, she cried because the enemy had given her hot water and soap, and she did not know what to do with that kindness. When she stepped out, clean clothes waited. Not a uniform, but simple civilian clothes, a grey dress, thick socks, sturdy shoes, everything clean, everything whole. Dinner was served at 6 in the mess hall. The smell hit Liesel first. Roasted meat, bread, real vegetables. She picked up a tray and moved through the line. A soldier put roasted chicken on her plate. Another added mashed potatoes, green beans, thick bread with butter, a cup of coffee, steam rising. Liesel stared at the tray. This could not be real. This was more food than she had seen in a year. She sat down and took a small bite of chicken. The taste exploded on her tongue. Rich, savory, perfectly seasoned. She had forgotten food could taste like this. Before she knew it, she had eaten half the plate. Across the table, an older woman cried into her hands. "My children are starving in Berlin," she whispered, "and I am eating chicken." Liesel understood. The guilt was crushing. How could the enemy feed her better than her own country ever had? This was not propaganda. This was not a trick. This was reality, and it was breaking everything she thought she knew. The first full day at Camp Co began at 7 in the morning. A bell rang. Liesel sat up in her bunk, disoriented, then remembered where she was. Around her, the other women stirred. The barracks were warm. The bed had been soft. She had slept through the night for the first time in months. Breakfast was eggs, toast, oatmeal, and coffee. Again, more food than Liesel had seen in a year. She ate slowly, her stomach still adjusting. After breakfast, work assignments were handed out. Liesel and several other women were assigned to the camp laundry. It was not hard work. Sorting clothes, operating washing machines, hanging things to dry. The laundry room was warm and steamy, filled with the smell of soap and clean cotton. A young American corporal supervised them, but mostly he sat at a desk reading magazines. He did not yell, he did not threaten, he just showed them how the machines worked and left them alone. By the end of the first week, Liesel had settled into a routine. Wake at 7, breakfast, work until lunch, more work until 4, free time, dinner at 6, evening activities, sleep. It was simple, predictable, almost boring. And yet, beneath the routine, confusion gnawed at her. She was supposed to be punished. She was supposed to be broken. Instead, she was doing laundry and eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a real bed. Sergeant Harold Thompson was everywhere in the camp. He seemed to be in charge of prisoner welfare, and Liesel saw him often, checking on barracks, talking to guards, making sure supplies were adequate. He learned the women's names. He asked how they were adjusting. He listened when they had complaints. Some women found it strange, others found it comforting. Liesel did not know what to think. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into her time at the camp, Liesel was walking back from the laundry when she passed Thompson outside the administration building. He was smoking a cigarette, watching the snow fall. "Liesel," he said, recognizing her. "How are you settling in?" She stopped, unsure how to respond. "I am fine," she said carefully. Her English was limited but functional. "Good, that's good." He took a drag and exhaled slowly. "You look better than when you arrived. Less scared." Liesel did not know what to say. She was less scared. It was true, but that almost made it worse. Thompson seemed to sense her confusion. "It's okay to be confused," he said gently. "I know this isn't what you expected, but we're not monsters, Liesel. We're just soldiers doing a job. And part of that job is making sure you're treated humanely." "Why?" The question came out before she could stop it. Thompson looked at her thoughtfully. "Why treat you humanely?" He considered the question. "Because it's the right thing to do, because you're people, not animals." He paused. "You have family back in Germany?" Liesel hesitated. A mother? She said finally. In Hamburg. You miss her? The question was like a knife. Liesel felt her throat tighten. I do not know. Thompson's eyes softened. That's an honest answer, he said quietly. Over the following weeks, Liesel found herself stopping by Thompson's office more often, at first just to ask practical questions. But gradually, the conversations became deeper. One cold December afternoon, Thompson found Liesel sitting alone in the recreation room, staring out the window at the snow. He sat down across from her. Christmas is coming, he said. First one away from home, I imagine. Liesel nodded. Christmas had always been her favorite time of year, but that was before the war, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. We're planning a small celebration here, Thompson said. Nothing fancy, a tree, some decorations, maybe some carols. Why do you do this? Liesel asked suddenly. Why do you care about us? We are the enemy. Thompson was quiet for a long moment. I have a daughter, he said finally. Back home in Ohio, Dorothy, she's about your age, and I think about her every day. I think about what I would want for her if she was in your situation. He looked at Liesel, his eyes serious. You're not the enemy to me, Liesel. You're a scared kid who got caught up in something bigger than herself. Maybe I can't fix the war, maybe I can't send you home, but I can make sure you have a warm bed and a decent meal. That's something. Liesel felt tears prick her eyes. My mother did not think that way, she whispered. I know, Thompson said gently, and I'm sorry. They sat in silence. Finally, Thompson stood up. You know what? I'm going to get you some hot chocolate. Best cure for a cold day. He disappeared and came back with 2 mugs of steaming hot chocolate. He handed one to Liesel. She took a sip. It was rich and sweet and warm, and it tasted like childhood, like Christmas mornings, like everything she had lost. A tear slipped down her cheek. It's okay to cry, Thompson said. God knows you've earned it. So, Liesel cried. And somewhere in that moment, sitting in an enemy camp in Minnesota, drinking hot chocolate with an American soldier who treated her with more kindness than her own mother had, something shifted. The wall around her heart developed a crack, small but undeniable. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The news came over the radio one evening, crackling through the speakers in the recreation room. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead, the Third Reich was finished. The women at Camp Co gathered around the radio, listening in stunned silence. Some cried, some sat in shock, some simply stared at nothing, trying to process what it meant. For Liesel, the news brought a strange mix of emotions, relief that the killing was over, grief for all that had been lost, and underneath it all, a deep, aching fear. The war was over. Soon she would be sent back. That night, Liesel could not sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Finally, she got up and walked outside. The night was warm, the air soft with the promise of summer. Stars scattered across the sky, more stars than she had ever seen in Hamburg, with its city lights. She heard footsteps behind her. Thompson appeared, wearing civilian clothes, looking tired. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. Liesel shook her head. They stood in silence for a while, looking up at the stars. I am afraid, Liesel said finally. I am afraid to go back. I know, Thompson said. I would be too. Here, I feel safe, Liesel continued. Here, I feel like I matter. But back there, she trailed off, unable to finish. Thompson turned to face her, placing his hands on her shoulders. Listen to me, Liesel. You do matter. You always did. Your mother's actions don't define your worth. Nothing can take that away from you. Liesel looked up at him through tears. You are more like a father to me than anyone has ever been. Thompson pulled her into a hug. You're like a daughter to me, he said quietly. I know that sounds strange, given the circumstances, but it's true. The women at Camp Co were allowed to write letters home. They were given paper, envelopes, and stamps. The letters would be reviewed by censors before being sent, but they could write. Liesel had written to her mother weeks earlier, a short, cold letter. Mother, I am alive. I am in America in a camp. They are treating us well. I do not know when I will come home. I do not know if I want to. Liesel. No reply had come. Liesel had not expected one, but the silence still hurt. As spring gave way to summer, the camp began to change. The days grew longer, the air grew warmer, and Liesel began to change too. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out. The dark circles under her eyes faded. Her hair began to shine again. She looked healthy. She looked alive. More than that, she began to smile. She made friends among the other prisoners. She laughed at jokes. She sang songs in the recreation room. She felt like she belonged to something again. But beneath it all, she knew it could not last. In August, the announcement came. The women would be repatriated. Ships were being arranged. They would be going home. Over 372,000 German POWs were returned to Europe from American camps between 1945 and 1946. Liesel would be among them. The final weeks at camp passed too quickly. Liesel tried to memorize everything. The way sunlight streamed through the mess hall windows, the smell of fresh laundry, the sound of the other women laughing, the feeling of safety that had become so familiar. On her last day, Thompson called her to his office. When she arrived, he had prepared a small care package, food for the journey, a blanket, and a letter. For when you arrive, he said. Liesel opened the letter with shaking hands. It was written in his careful handwriting. Dear Liesel, by the time you read this, you'll be on your way back to Germany. I won't pretend it will be easy, but you have the strength to handle whatever comes. You've already survived so much. Remember, your mother's choices don't define your worth. You are valuable, you are loved, you matter. And somewhere in Ohio, there's a man who thinks of you as a daughter and always will. If you ever need anything, if you ever want to write, my address is at the bottom of this letter. Don't hesitate. You're not alone. Love, Harold Thompson. Liesel read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She carefully folded it and placed it in her pocket. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for being my father when my own mother could not be my mother. Thompson hugged her one last time. Be safe, Liesel. Be happy. Live a good life. The next morning, she boarded the bus that would take her to the train station. As Campco disappeared behind her, Liesel realized the impossible truth. She was leaving home to go back to a place that had never really been one. The journey back to Germany was long and uncomfortable. The ship was crowded with returning prisoners, everyone anxious and uncertain about what they would find. When they finally arrived in Bremen, Liesel saw the devastation for the first time since she had left. The port city was a skeleton, buildings reduced to rubble, streets choked with debris. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin, hollow-eyed, hungry. From Bremen, she made her way to Hamburg. The journey took 3 days on overcrowded trains and buses. When she finally reached her old neighborhood, she almost did not recognize it. The apartment building where she had lived was still standing, but many around it were not. Over 80% of Hamburg's city center had been destroyed during the war. Liesel climbed the stairs to her mother's apartment, her heart pounding. She did not know what she would say. She did not know if she even wanted to see her mother. But she had to know. She had to face it. She knocked on the door. For a long moment there was no answer. Then she heard footsteps. The door opened. Her mother stood there, thinner than Liesel remembered, older, more worn. When she saw Liesel, her eyes widened. Liesel, she breathed. Liesel looked at the woman who had betrayed her and felt a strange calm settle over her. I came to tell you I am alive, Liesel said quietly, and to tell you goodbye. Her mother's face crumpled. Liesel, please. No, Liesel interrupted. You made your choice. You pointed at me. You turned me in. I spent months not understanding why, but now I realize it does not matter why. What matters is that you did it, and I cannot forgive that. She pulled out the photograph Thompson had given her, him with his wife Eleanor and daughter Dorothy, standing in front of their Ohio home. I found a real family, Liesel said. People who cared about me, who protected me, who showed me what love looks like. They were supposed to be my enemies, but they were kinder to me than you ever were. Her mother was crying now, but Liesel felt nothing. The wound was too deep. I am leaving Hamburg, Liesl said. I am going to Munich to start over. I do not know if I will come back. Maybe someday, maybe never. But I want you to know that I survived. Despite what you did, I survived. She turned and walked away, down the stairs, out of the building, into the grey Hamburg morning. She did not look back. Liesl found work in Munich as a secretary for a British occupation office. The work was steady, the pay decent. It allowed her to build a new life far from her past. And she wrote to Thompson just as he had told her to. She told him about the confrontation, about her new job, about her slow efforts to rebuild. And he wrote back, long, thoughtful letters that reminded her she was valued. That encouraged her to keep going. Over the years, the letters continued. Thompson became simply Harold in her letters. He sent photographs of Dorothy's wedding. He told her when his first grandchild was born. He shared his life, and Liesl shared hers. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Liesl met Werner. He was kind, patient, and understood that she carried wounds that might never fully heal. They married in 1953. In 1955, they had a daughter. Liesl named her Dorothy, after Harold's daughter. When baby Dorothy was born, Liesl wrote to Harold with the news. His response came a week later. I am honored beyond words. Give that little girl a kiss from her American grandfather. As Dorothy grew, Liesl told her the story about the war, about betrayal, about an American soldier who showed her that family is not always about blood. In 1968, 23 years after the war ended, Harold Thompson finally came to visit Germany. He was older now, grey-haired and slower, but his eyes were the same, kind, steady, full of warmth. Liesl met him at the Munich train station with Werner and 13-year-old Dorothy. When she saw him step off the train, she ran to him. He caught her in a hug that felt like coming home. "Hello, kiddo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, Dad," Liesl said. It was the first time she had called him that out loud, but it felt right. It felt true. Harold Thompson died in 1982 at the age of 73. Liesl flew to Ohio for the funeral. At the service, Dorothy, Harold's daughter, approached her. "Dad talked about you all the time," she said. "He said you were his German daughter. He said helping you was one of the best things he ever did." Liesl smiled through her tears. "He saved me," she said. "In every way a person can be saved." This is the story worth remembering. Not just the battles or the politics, but the small, human moments that reveal who we truly are. A mother who betrayed, a soldier who cared, a cup of hot chocolate that changed a life. Liesl Hartmann learned that blood does not make family. Love makes family. Showing up makes family. Kindness makes family. Her own mother had turned her into the enemy, but the enemy had become her father. This was not propaganda. This was not an exception. Over 425,000 German POWs were held in the United States during World War II, and the vast majority were treated according to the Geneva Conventions, fed, housed, and treated humanely. It was policy. It was deliberate. It was America's quiet answer to tyranny, not cruelty for cruelty, but decency in the face of hate. Sometimes the people who save you are the ones you least expect. And sometimes the greatest weapon is not a bomb but a blanket, not a bullet, but a cup of hot chocolate offered to a frightened girl far from home. Family, in the end, is not who you are born to. It is who shows up when you need the most.